There is a particular kind of evening in London that seems to exist for remembering. The fog settles low over the rooftops, thick enough to blur the gaslight into soft amber halos, and somewhere below, a hansom cab moves slowly over wet cobblestones, its wheels making a sound like a long, patient sigh. It is on such an evening, with the fire low and the curtains drawn, that I find myself once again taking up my pen, not to solve anything, not to prove anything, but simply to remember. I am speaking, of course, of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and of the rooms we shared for so many years at 221B Baker Street. If you have never been there, let me describe it to you, quietly, as I would describe an old photograph to a friend beside the fire. Baker Street, at night, was never entirely silent. There was always some far-off sound, a church bell, a dog, a cab horse shifting its weight. But the street itself, in the hours after midnight, took on a stillness that felt almost private, as though the whole city had agreed to lower its voice. Our sitting room sat above the street, two tall windows looking down upon the pavement, and within, a fire that Mrs. Hudson kept burning long after most sensible households had gone dark. It was in that room that I saw Sherlock Holmes at his most himself. Not the version of him the newspapers occasionally described, the brilliant eccentric of Scotland Yard's whispered frustrations, but the quieter man who sat for hours with his pipe unlit in his hand, staring at nothing, until suddenly he was staring at everything. Holmes was, in his way, an easy man to be near, provided one did not require conversation. He could go an entire evening in silence, his violin resting untouched against the wall, his chemical apparatus bubbling faintly in the corner, and then, without warning, he might look up and tell you precisely what you had been thinking for the last quarter of an hour, simply by the way you had glanced twice at the clock and once at your empty pipe. I never fully grew used to it. I am not sure I was meant to. Tonight, I find myself thinking of several of the strange matters that came to our door, some of them frightening, some of them merely curious, all of them, I think, worth remembering slowly, the way one remembers the shape of a room one loved. There was the case of the king who came to us in a mask. There was the strange business of a man's hair, red as fire, and an advertisement that should never have existed. There was a young woman who wrote to us in terror of a whistle in the night, and a house with iron bars upon the windows of a room that should not have needed them. There was a Christmas goose, and a stone worth more than the goose could ever have known. And there was, near the very end, a story Holmes told me himself, one quiet evening, of the very first case he ever solved. Long before I knew him, long before Baker Street, long before he was the man the world would one day speak of. I do not intend to rush through any of it. Holmes always said that the most important clues were the smallest ones, and that a man who moves quickly through a room sees far less than a man who is content to sit still in it. So let us sit still a while. Let the fire burn low. Let the fog gather at the windows. Let the city go on without us for a few hours. And let me tell you, slowly, the way I remember it, what happened on those nights at Baker Street, beginning with the evening a carriage far too grand for our humble street stopped outside our door, and a man in a mask climbed our 17 steps. It was a March night, cold enough that the windows had fogged from the inside when I returned to Baker Street after an absence of some months. I had married and taken up a practice of my own across the city, and though I thought of Holmes often, the business of a young doctor's life had kept me from Baker Street longer than I liked. I had walked past the old house that evening quite by accident, or so I told myself, on my way home from a patient, and I found myself pausing beneath the familiar window, watching his tall, spare silhouette pass twice across the blind, head bowed, hands clasped behind him, in the restless pacing I knew so well. I could not resist. I climbed the steps and rang the bell, as I had 100 times before. Holmes greeted me warmly in his own reserved fashion, waving me toward the old armchair as though I had merely stepped out for tobacco, and returned an hour later rather than having been gone the better part of a year. "Watson," he said, settling into the chair opposite, "marriage suits you. You have put on 7.5 pounds since I saw you last." "7?" I said. 7.5, he replied, without looking up from his pipe. "Your right slipper is scorched in a manner that suggests you have taken to warming your feet dangerously close to the fire, a habit, I think, encouraged by a wife who does not scold you for it, as I once did. And you have been in practice again, for there is the faint but unmistakable smell of iodoform about you, along with a black mark of nitrate of silver upon your right forefinger, and a bulge in the right side of your top hat where you have secreted your stethoscope. I could hardly fail to deduce that you are a medical man in active practice." I laughed, as I always did, though the laughter was, as always, tinged faintly with the old astonishment. If I were to tell my patients how you read my comings and goings from a scorch mark and a stethoscope, they would think me a very transparent sort of man. "You are not transparent," said Holmes. "You are merely observed. There is a considerable difference, though few people trouble to notice it." We sat a while in the old, comfortable silence, the fire snapping softly, the fog pressing at the windows, and I found myself grateful, in a way I had not expected, simply to be back in that room. It was into this quiet that the letter arrived. Mrs. Hudson brought it up herself, remarking that a boy had delivered it not 10 minutes before and had run off before she could ask his business. Holmes turned it over in his long fingers before opening it, and I watched him do what he always did with any new piece of evidence. He studied it before he read it. "Heavy paper," he murmured, half to himself. "Stiff, almost like a card. Not English paper, I think. And see here, Watson, the watermark. E.G. and a P. The remains of a monogram, no doubt. If you consult my index under the letter E, you will find a paper mill in Bohemia that produces exactly this sort of stock." "Bohemia?" I repeated. "We shall know more shortly, I imagine, for unless I am very much mistaken, I hear the wheels of a very well-sprung carriage outside our window, and the tread of a pair of very expensive horses." We rose together and looked down into the street. A carriage of unusual splendor stood at the curb, a brougham drawn by a pair of magnificent bays, their harness gleaming even through the fog. As we watched, a footman in livery stepped down to open the door, and a figure emerged, tall, cloaked, and wearing, most curiously of all, a black visored mask that covered the upper half of his face. "A curious visitor," I said. "A very ordinary visitor, trying very hard not to be recognized," said Holmes, "which is, in its own way, the most extraordinary thing a man can do in London." The stranger climbed our stairs heavily, and a moment later Mrs. Hudson showed him into our sitting room, where he stood for a moment simply looking about him, as a man does when he has walked into surroundings considerably humbler than his own and is deciding how to feel about it. He was a big man, well over 6 feet, with the chest and limbs of a Hercules. His dress, beneath the travelling cloak, was rich to the point of gaudiness. A coat trimmed with astrakhan fur, a blue cloak lined with flame-coloured silk, and a brooch at his throat set with a single flashing stone that I did not like to guess the value of. The mask remained across his eyes, and it was several long seconds before he spoke. "You had my note," he said, in a voice that was deep and carried the faint, careful precision of a man speaking a language not entirely his own. "I told you that I would call." "Pray, take a seat," said Holmes, quite unmoved by the splendor before him. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who is occasionally good enough to assist me in my cases. Whom have I the honor of addressing?" "You may address me as the Count von Cram, a Bohemian nobleman. I understand that this gentleman, your friend, is a man of honor and discretion, whom I may trust with a matter of the most extreme importance. If not, I should much prefer to communicate with you alone." I made to rise, but Holmes caught my wrist and pushed me back into my chair. "It is both or neither," said he. "You may say before this, 'Gentlemen, anything which you may say to me.'" The Count hesitated, glanced once more about the modest room, and then, with a sudden motion, tore the mask from his face and flung it upon the floor. "You are right," he said. "I am the king." Holmes did not so much as raise an eyebrow. "I was already aware," he said mildly, "that I was addressing Wilhelm Gottsreich Sigismund von Ormstein, Grand Duke of Kassel-Felstein and hereditary King of Bohemia." The king stared at him, and then laughed, though there was little humor in it. "You understand, of course, that I did not travel in my own person to consult you. But the matter is of such weight that a false step might imperil the throne of Europe." "Then let us hear it," said Holmes, folding his hands and closing his eyes, in the attitude that told me he was now listening with his entire mind. What followed I have set down many times since, though I never tire of it, for it is one of the strangest and, I think, one of the gentlest stories to come out of our years together. Some years before, the king told us, while a young man visiting Warsaw, he had formed an attachment to a woman named Irene Adler, an American, formerly of the New Jersey opera houses, now retired and living quietly in London. There had been letters. There had been, worse still, a photograph. The two of them together, taken in a private moment neither had intended for public eyes. Now the king was to be married to the second daughter of the King of Scandinavia, a family of the strictest and most puritanical views. Should the photograph come to light before the wedding, the match, and with it, the king said, matters of great political consequence, would be shattered beyond repair. "She has sworn to send it to them on the day my engagement is announced," said the king. "I have had the matter investigated, her house searched, her luggage waylaid, her person twice searched by agents. Nothing. The photograph is not to be found." "And yet you believe she still possesses it?" "I am certain of it." "Then," said Holmes, opening his eyes at last, "we must find where a clever woman keeps a thing she wishes never to be found. Give me until tomorrow evening, Your Majesty, and I believe I shall have news for you." The king left as he had come, in his splendid carriage, vanishing into the fog, and Holmes sat a long while afterward without speaking, his pipe sending up slow ribbons of smoke into the lamplight. "A charming problem," he said at last. "You perceive, Watson, that a photograph is a very difficult thing to hide from a determined search, unless one hides it not by concealment, but by circumstance. I think we shall have to go and see Miss Irene Adler for ourselves." I will not set down here every detail of the days that followed, save to say that Holmes spent much of the next morning transformed, quite convincingly, into a drunken and disreputable groom, loitering about the mews near Miss Adler's house in St. John's Wood, gathering gossip from stable boys with a skill that would have shamed a professional actor. He learned, among other things, that Miss Adler had a gentleman caller, a lawyer named Godfrey Norton, who visited nearly every day, and that the two were, by all appearances, deeply attached. It was while Holmes stood watching the house that afternoon that Mr. Norton himself arrived in great haste, entered the house, and emerged again within minutes, calling for a cab and directing it at a gallop to the Church of St. Monica. Moments later, Miss Adler herself appeared, radiant, and likewise called for a cab to the same destination. Holmes did not hesitate. He hired a cab of his own and followed. He arrived at the church to find a small, curious wedding in progress. So small, in fact, that when Holmes entered, the clergyman turned to him with evident relief and asked whether he would consent to act as a witness, there being no one else present to serve. Holmes, ever adaptable, agreed at once, and so it was that my friend found himself, quite by accident, a legal witness to the private marriage of Miss Irene Adler and Mr. Godfrey Norton. A very singular position for me to occupy, Watson, he told me that evening, with something almost like amusement in his voice. "But it may prove useful. A married woman guards her secrets rather differently than an unmarried one." That evening, we returned to the house on Serpentine Avenue, Holmes now disguised once more, time as an elderly and rather feeble clergyman, and I stationed at his instructions some distance off, holding a plain smoke rocket, waiting for a signal. "When I raise my hand," he told me, "throw what I have given you in through the window and raise the cry of fire. Then wait for me at the corner and say nothing more." I did not fully understand the purpose of this scheme, but I had long since learned to trust Holmes in such matters, even when, perhaps especially when, I did not grasp his reasoning. The plan unfolded exactly as he had designed it. As Miss Adler's carriage returned and she stepped down before her door, a sudden scuffle among some loafers in the street, arranged, I later learned, by Holmes himself, brought Holmes, in his clergyman's disguise, rushing forward as if to protect her from the crowd, receiving in the process a blow to the chest that left him, apparently, quite badly hurt. Miss Adler, moved by evident compassion, insisted the injured old clergyman be carried into her own sitting room to recover. It was there, once inside, that I threw the smoke rocket through the window at Holmes's signal and raised the cry of fire. The effect was immediate. The street filled with shouting, and inside the house, Irene Adler, as any person will do when they believe their home to be burning, went at once, without a single moment's hesitation, to the one object she most wished to save. Holmes watched her do it, and said nothing, and a few moments later, once the false alarm had been quieted, took his leave, thanking her for her kindness to an injured old man, and walked with me calmly back toward Baker Street. "You saw it, Watson," he said, once we were well clear of the square. The moment the cry of fire went up, her very first instinct was to go to a sliding panel above the bell pull, half draw out a certain document, and then, upon realizing there was no true danger, replace it. I now know to the inch precisely where the photograph is hidden. Tomorrow, with the King's authority, we shall simply go and take it. I confess I felt that night a certain quiet admiration for the plan, its patience, its gentleness even, for nowhere in it had Holmes threatened the lady, deceived her cruelly, or done her any lasting harm. It was, in its way, one of the kindest deceptions I ever saw him practice. But London and Irene Adler had one more surprise for us. We returned early the next morning, the King himself accompanying us this time, eager to have the matter closed before his wedding announcement. But when the maid answered the door, it was to inform us, with a curious lack of surprise, that Miss Adler and her husband had left by the early train for the continent that very morning, never to return. Holmes, rather than showing frustration, seemed almost pleased. He asked to be shown into the sitting room, where, exactly where he had described, he found not the photograph, but a letter addressed to himself. I have read that letter so many times since that I believe I could recite it from memory, but I shall give here only its essential heart, for I think it says a great deal about the woman who wrote it, and perhaps something about my friend as well. She had recognized him, she wrote, recognized him from the very first, in his clergyman's disguise, for she had been warned, some time before, by friends in the theatrical profession to be wary of exactly such a visitor, and had studied the art of disguise herself for her former profession upon the stage. She had let the ruse play out, simply to see how far Mr. Sherlock Holmes would go, and she had been, she confessed, rather charmed by his ingenuity. She bore the King no ill will, she wrote, but she would not be threatened, and so she and her new husband had decided to leave the country entirely, taking the photograph with her, not as a weapon, but simply as a keepsake of a chapter in her life now closed. She left in its place another photograph of herself alone, should the King wish for a memento. Holmes read this letter through twice in complete silence, and then, to my considerable surprise, began to laugh. Not unkindly, but with a genuine, quiet appreciation. "What a woman," he said softly. "I told His Majesty that she was a match for anyone, and I fancy I have never been more right in my life." When the king learned the news, his relief was so great that he barely seemed to register that he had, in fact, been outwitted entirely. He offered Holmes a magnificent emerald ring from his own finger as reward. Holmes declined it. "Your Majesty has something," he said, "which I should value even more. You have but to name it. This photograph." And that was all Holmes ever asked in payment. Afterward, when the king had gone and the fire had burned low again in our sitting room, I asked Holmes whether he was not troubled that a woman had, in the end, gotten the better of him. "Troubled?" he said, filling his pipe slowly. "Watson, I think you misunderstand. When I speak of her, I do not speak of her as a woman I failed to outwit. I speak of her as the woman, for in my experience, she is quite the only one who ever came close to doing so. There is a particular kind of admiration reserved for an opponent who defeats you cleanly, without malice, and by nothing but her own wit. I find I bear the lady no resentment whatsoever. He never did, so far as I know, in all the years I knew him. And whenever, in later days, Holmes spoke of Irene Adler, it was never otherwise than under the honourable title of the woman. The clock had gone 11 by the time I rose to leave that night, and Holmes remained in his chair by the fire, quite still, the small photograph of Irene Adler resting on the table beside him where he could see it. I let myself out quietly, into a London grown cold and silent, and I remember thinking, as I walked home through the fog, that there was something almost restful in a mystery that ended not with a villain punished, but simply with two clever people going their separate ways, each having thought rather well of the other. Some months passed before another case brought me again to Baker Street, and this time it was autumn, the leaves gone from brown to black in the gutters, the evenings drawing in early enough that the lamps were lit by 4 o'clock. I called upon Holmes one afternoon to find him deep in conversation with a stout, elderly gentleman of exceedingly red hair, and I very nearly withdrew, not wishing to intrude upon a client. Holmes waved me in at once. "You come at the right moment, Watson. This is Mr. Jabez Wilson, and he has been telling me one of the most singular tales I have listened to for some time. I should be glad if you would stay and hear it, for I suspect we shall want your assistance before the day is out." Mr. Wilson was a portly, rather slow-moving man, dressed with the plain respectability of a small shopkeeper, and his flaming red hair was, without exaggeration, the most vivid I have ever seen upon a human head, the colour of a ripe orange, almost painful to look upon in the firelight. He held in his lap a torn and crumpled newspaper, which he consulted anxiously from time to time as he spoke. "I confess, Mr. Holmes," he was saying as I sat down, "that I can make neither head nor tail of it, and if you can throw any light upon it, I shall be very much in your debt, for I have lost a great deal of money and gained nothing whatsoever in exchange but wasted time." "Pray begin at the beginning," said Holmes, settling back with his fingertips together and his eyes half closed, "and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem to you. Trivial things, Mr. Wilson, are very often the most important." Mr. Wilson cleared his throat, glanced once more at his newspaper for reassurance, and began. He kept, he told us, a small pawnbroker's shop at Sainsbury's, near the city, a modest but steady business, assisted by a single employee, a young man named Vincent Spaulding, who had come to him some months before at half the usual wages, on the sole condition, oddly enough, that he be permitted to spend certain hours in the cellar developing photographs, a hobby of his. Wilson had thought nothing of this eccentricity, being glad of cheap and capable help, and Spaulding had proved himself, in every other respect, an excellent and industrious assistant. It was Spaulding, in fact, who had first shown him the advertisement, a curious notice in the paper some 8 weeks earlier, announcing a vacancy in something called the Red-Headed League, open only to men of that particular colouring, offering light duties and a salary of £4 a week for a few hours' work each morning. £4 a week, Mr. Holmes, for next to nothing. I could hardly credit it, and I confess I laughed at first, thinking it some joke. But Spaulding urged me strongly to apply, saying it was a chance not to be missed, and being a man of business, and £4 a week being £4 a week, I thought I would look into it. The office of the League, he told us, had been besieged that morning with red-headed applicants of every shade, some so pale as to be almost strawberry, some so dark as to be nearly mahogany, queued the entire length of Fleet Street and around the corner into Pope's Court. Wilson, whose hair he assured us was of a particularly fine and unusual shade, had very nearly given up hope of ever gaining entrance, until Spaulding, elbowing and pushing with a determination Wilson had not known him to possess, managed to force a path through the crowd for his employer. Inside, a small office contained 2 chairs, a deal table, and a gentleman as red-headed as Wilson himself, who examined the candidates one by one, most of them being dismissed after the briefest glance for some minor imperfection in their colouring, until Wilson's own turn came, whereupon the gentleman, one Mr. Duncan Ross, declared himself entirely satisfied, and even went so far as to tug sharply upon Wilson's hair to be certain it was not a wig. He pulled it hard enough to bring the tears to my eyes, Mr. Holmes, and seemed vastly relieved when he found it was genuine. Said there had been 2 frauds already that week, one with a wig and one with dye, and a man could not be too careful. The work itself, Wilson explained, proved almost absurdly simple. He was to attend the League's offices in Pope's Court each day from 10 until 2, and during that time to copy out, in his own hand, the entirety of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, beginning, as it happened, with the letter A. He was provided pen, ink and paper, examined once weekly by Mr. Duncan Ross to confirm his attendance and his work, and paid his £4 each Saturday without fail. For 8 weeks, Wilson had presented himself faithfully, filling page after page with his careful copying of abbots and archery and armour and architecture, quite content with his curious fortune, until that very morning when he had arrived at Pope's Court to find the office locked, and upon the door a small card. He produced it now, and Holmes took it and read aloud, "The Red-Headed League is dissolved, October 9th, 1890. I could get no explanation from anyone, Wilson went on, and when I went to the landlord downstairs, a Mr. William Morris, to ask after the League, he told me he had never heard of any Duncan Ross, nor any Red-Headed League at all, and referred me instead to a firm of solicitors, who in turn had never heard of either the League or Mr. Ross. In short, Mr. Holmes, the whole thing appears to have vanished into thin air, and I have lost, I calculate, £32, and I should very much like to know why." Throughout this whole recital, Holmes had listened with his eyes closed and his fingers steepled, but I noticed, as I always did in such moments, that his stillness was not inattention, but its very opposite, a concentration so complete that it produced a kind of physical repose. "This is not a matter for despair, Mr. Wilson," he said at last, opening his eyes. "I think it may prove, upon examination, considerably more interesting than distressing. Tell me, this assistant of yours, Vincent Spaulding, how long has he been with you, and what manner of man is he?" "A little over a month before the advertisement appeared, sir. A quiet fellow, 30 years old perhaps, does his work well, and asks for very little beyond his modest wage and his hours in the cellar. He has a curious white splash of acid upon his forehead, which he says came from an accident, and I believe he pierces his ears, for he wears rings in them, in the fashion of a sailor. Holmes's eyes opened rather wider at this, though his face otherwise betrayed nothing. "Just as I suspected," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Have you observed, Mr. Wilson, whether his trousers are at all worn or discoloured at the knees?" Wilson stared at him, plainly bewildered by so odd a question, but admitted, after some thought, that yes, he believed they were, now that he considered it. "Quite so," said Holmes, and would say nothing further on the subject. "I must think this over, Mr. Wilson. Today is Saturday, and I hope that by Monday we may have come to a conclusion. In the meanwhile, ask me no questions, and say nothing of this matter to your assistant." When Wilson had gone, shuffling off into the grey afternoon with his newspaper still tucked beneath his arm, Holmes sat for some time without speaking, smoking a pipe of a particularly strong tobacco he reserved, I had learned, for problems requiring what he called a 3-pipe measure of thought. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he said at last. "I confess, I could make nothing whatsoever of it," I admitted. "It seems to me one of the strangest tales I have ever heard." "The stranger the tale," said Holmes, rising and reaching for his hat, "the less mysterious it generally proves. It is your commonplace, featureless crimes that are truly difficult, Watson, just as a commonplace face is the hardest to describe. But this affair, I think, will not remain obscure for very long. Come, let us take a walk to Sainsbury's. I should like to see this pawnbroker's shop and its assistant for myself." We took a train to the neighbourhood in question, and Holmes led me down a narrow, somewhat shabby street until we came to Wilson's shop, above which hung a faded sign advertising his trade. Holmes stopped before it, studied it a long moment, his eyes moving slowly from the pavement to the upper windows and back again, and then, to my surprise, walked directly up to the door and rapped upon it sharply with his stick. It was opened almost at once by a bright-looking young man, clean-shaven, who invited us in. "Thank you," said Holmes. "I only wish to ask the way to the Strand." "Third right, fourth left," answered the young man promptly, and shut the door. Holmes said nothing until we had turned the corner, and then he began quite suddenly to laugh, a rare enough sound from him that I looked at him in some surprise. "A remarkable man, that," he said. "I judge him to be the 4th smartest man in London, and for daring, I am not sure he does not deserve to be 3rd. I have had some knowledge of him before." "What did you learn from him, beyond the direction to the Strand?" "I did not care in the least about his knowledge of the Strand. I wished only to see his knees." "His knees?" "Precisely as I expected. Worn, wrinkled, and stained, exactly as a man's knees become who spends a great deal of time crawling upon the ground. Watson, that was the answer to the whole problem. Though there remains one thing I wish to see before we return home. Let us walk round to the street directly behind this one." We turned the corner, and Holmes stood a while, gazing at the row of buildings that backed onto Wilson's pawn shop, an ordinary street of banks and small businesses, remarkable, so far as I could tell, for nothing at all. "Ah," said Holmes softly, and I followed his gaze to a modest brass plate upon one of the doors, reading, "The City and Suburban Bank." "That," he said, "explains a great deal. Come, Watson, it is Saturday afternoon, and I believe our friend Mr. Wilson's little mystery is very nearly solved. But there remains work to be done tonight, and I shall want your revolver. Meet me here at 10 o'clock this evening." I asked no further questions, for I had long since learned that Holmes, when in this mood, revealed his conclusions only when he judged the moment fit, and that pressing him did nothing but amuse him at my expense. That evening we were joined, to my surprise, by Mr. Merriweather, a director of the City and Suburban Bank, and by none other than Mr. Peter Jones, an inspector of Scotland Yard, whom Holmes greeted with the wry courtesy of an old, if not entirely respectful, acquaintance. The four of us made our way, in the deepening dark, to the very bank whose plate Holmes had studied that afternoon, and were led down into its cellar, a stone vault stacked high with wooden crates, beneath which, Mr. Merriweather explained in a low voice, lay some 30,000 Napoleons in gold, borrowed recently from the Bank of France to strengthen their reserves. Holmes examined the floor of the vault with his lantern, crouching low, and then straightened with an air of quiet satisfaction. "I think we have at least an hour to wait," he said, "for they can hardly do anything until the good pawnbroker is safely in his bed. Then they will not lose a minute, for the sooner the work is done, the longer time they will have for their escape." We took our places behind the packing cases, in darkness so complete that I could see nothing whatsoever, though I could hear, after a time, the quiet breathing of my companions, and once the far-off chime of a church clock marking the passing hours. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I saw, suddenly, a thin line of light appear upon the stone floor, a crack, widening, and then a hand, and then an entire arm, thrust up through what I now realized was a hole cut cleanly in the flagstones. A face followed, young, keen, and streaked with dirt, glancing quickly about the cellar before its owner began to haul himself up through the opening. In an instant, Holmes had sprung forward and seized the man by the collar. There was a brief, violent struggle, a pistol flashed and was struck aside, and then Jones had the man's wrists in a pair of handcuffs before he could so much as cry out. "You've no chance at all, John Clay," said Holmes calmly, as the man glared up at him with something like grudging respect in his eyes. "So it would seem," said the man, for this was indeed Vincent Spaulding, or rather his true self, John Clay, murderer, thief, and forger, one of the cleverest criminals in London, as Jones informed us with considerable satisfaction, and grandson, it was said, of a duke, having himself been to Eton and Oxford before turning his considerable talents to crime. A second man, attempting to flee back through the tunnel, was seized by Jones's waiting constables above. It was only once we were back in Baker Street, the fire relit and a decanter set between us, that Holmes consented to explain the whole affair from the beginning. "You see, Watson, the case turned upon a single question. Why should anyone go to such extraordinary lengths and such considerable expense merely to keep a foolish, respectable pawnbroker occupied for a few hours each day? Clearly, it could not be for the sake of the copying itself. It must be that they wished him out of his shop, and specifically out of his cellar, for a fixed and predictable period each and every day. But why? That was my very question, and I found it answered the moment Wilson mentioned that his assistant was content to work for half wages purely for the privilege of spending his afternoons in the cellar. A man does not develop photographs for 4 hours a day without a very great deal of chemical smell about him, and there was none. No, he was engaged in some other business entirely, and a man who works underground, day after day, for months, and wears the knees of his trousers through in the process, is a man who is digging. "The tunnel," I said. "Precisely. I suspected at once that he was tunneling towards some other building, and the moment I saw the pawnbroker's face, a dull, honest, unremarkable man in a dull, unremarkable little street, I wished only to know what lay directly behind his shop. When I saw the bank, the entire matter arranged itself. A cunning, patient scheme, Watson. For weeks of digging require weeks free from interruption, and what better way to guarantee an empty house each morning than to invent an eccentric society and dangle £4 a week before the very man whose absence you require? I dare say it was Clay himself who wrote that advertisement, and Clay himself who sat behind the desk as Mr. Duncan Ross, tugging at poor Wilson's hair to be sure it was not a disguise, though I rather think the true purpose of the interview was only to be certain that Wilson would apply at all, and no other candidate steal the vacancy from him. How could you be so sure the attempt would come tonight? When the League was dissolved, it meant Mr. Jabez Wilson's presence in his own cellar was no longer of any importance to Mr. John Clay, which could only mean that the tunnel was complete and the work ready to be finished. A man does not close such an elaborate arrangement a day earlier than he must, Watson, for every day of the league cost him £4. The moment the sign appeared upon that door, I understood that the robbery was imminent, and that it must occur on a Saturday night, to give the thieves 2 full days' start before the banks reopened and the loss was discovered. I sat back in my chair, marvelling, not for the first time, at the elegant simplicity that lay beneath what had seemed, at the outset, one of the strangest tales I had ever encountered. "It is a comfort to me, Watson," Holmes said, knocking out his pipe against the hearth, "to have a case which is, for once, entirely bloodless. Poor Wilson loses nothing but a little time, and gains, dare say, a story he will dine out upon for the rest of his days. Not every problem need end in tragedy to be worth the solving." Outside, the fog had thickened once more, and somewhere far off, a church clock struck 3. Holmes settled back into his chair with the particular satisfaction of a man who has, for the moment, set the world back into its proper order. And I confess, I fell asleep myself, in that same chair, before the fire had burned entirely to ash. The winter that followed was a particularly bitter one, and I remember waking one morning in early April to find frost still thick upon the windows, though the calendar insisted spring had already come. I had been up late the night before, attending to a patient, and had only just fallen into a deep sleep when I was awakened by a hand upon my shoulder. It was my wife, her face concerned in the grey dawn light. "There is a young lady in the sitting room," she said quietly, "who insists she must speak with you at once. She seems very frightened, and she asks for you by name." I dressed hurriedly and came downstairs to find a woman waiting by the fire, dressed in black and heavily veiled, shivering despite the warmth of the room. She could not have been more than 30 years of age, though her hair was already shot with premature grey, and her face, when she lifted her veil, was drawn and weary, the face of one who has not slept well for some time. "Dr. Watson," she said, rising as I entered, "forgive me for calling at such an hour, but I am in desperate need of help, and I was told that you were the friend and associate of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I must see him at once. It is a matter of life and death." "Mr. Holmes no longer resides here," I told her gently, "but if you will allow me a few moments, I shall take you to him myself, for I believe he would wish to hear what you have to say." She agreed at once, and within the quarter hour we had taken a cab through the cold and empty streets to Baker Street, where I knew Holmes would already be awake, for he kept the most irregular hours of any man I have ever known, often working through the night and sleeping through the morning, or not sleeping at all for days at a time when a problem particularly absorbed him. Mrs. Hudson showed us up at once, and I found Holmes, as I had expected, already dressed, and standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the street below. "Good morning, Watson," he said, without turning. "I saw your cab from the window. You have brought a client, I see, and one who has travelled some distance in a dog-cart along heavy roads before catching the early train to town. I trust the matter is urgent, for no one rises before dawn on such a morning as this without good reason." The lady stared at him, and I confess I saw again the old familiar mixture of wonder and alarm that Holmes's observations so often produced in those who did not know him. "You are quite right," she said faintly, "but how could you possibly—" "The left side of your jacket is spattered with mud, in precisely the pattern thrown up by a dog-cart wheel," said Holmes, gesturing toward her with his coffee cup. "And there is no railway station within driving distance of Baker Street that would produce such mud at this time of year, save those to the south and west, where the roads are still soft from the recent rains. The return half of a second-class ticket from the South Western Railway is visible in your glove, and, unless I am very much mistaken, you rose early, drove through cold and darkness to catch the first available train, and came here directly, without even pausing for breakfast, all of which suggests a matter of some urgency. Pray sit down, and tell me what has brought you to London, Miss—" "Stoner," she said, sinking into the chair he offered. Miss Helen Stoner. And you are quite correct, Mr. Holmes. I am in the most terrible danger, and I do not know where else to turn." Holmes settled into his own chair, his fingers steepled, his face very calm and still, and I knew from long experience that he was now listening with the whole of his considerable attention. "You have my full attention, Miss Stoner," he said quietly. "Take your time, omit nothing, and do not trouble yourself with what may seem trivial. Begin at the beginning." Helen Stoner's story, as it unfolded over the next half hour, was one of the strangest and most unsettling I had yet heard, and I set it down here as she told it to us in that cold dawn, with the fire crackling softly and the fog pressing at the windows. She was, she told us, the last surviving member of what had once been one of the oldest and wealthiest families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran in Surrey. Her mother had married as her second husband Dr. Grimesby Roylott, a medical man who had practiced for many years in Calcutta and who had returned to England only after a series of violent quarrels had made it impossible for him to remain in India. Her mother had died some 8 years before, leaving the estate and what remained of the family fortune in trust to Dr. Roylott, with the provision that a certain sum be paid annually to each of her 2 daughters upon their marriage. Dr. Roylott, Helen told us, had once been a man of considerable charm and ability, but the years in India had changed him. He had grown violent, unpredictable, and prone to fits of uncontrollable rage. He kept no servants save a single housekeeper, refused all society, and spent his days wandering the grounds of the estate with a collection of exotic animals he had brought back from his travels, a cheetah, a baboon, and other creatures that roamed freely about the property, terrifying the few neighbours who still dared to call. 2 years before, Helen's sister Julia had become engaged to a young officer in the Marines, and had been looking forward to her wedding with the greatest happiness. But a fortnight before the ceremony, something had happened. Helen's voice faltered here, and I saw her hands tighten in her lap. "My sister and I," she continued slowly, "occupied adjoining bedrooms in the old manor house, and on the night in question, I was awakened by her screams. I ran into the corridor to find her standing in her doorway, swaying, her face white with terror. She staggered toward me, and I caught her in my arms, and as I held her, she whispered, 'Oh, Helen, it was the band, the speckled band.' She could say nothing more. She fell into convulsions, and within minutes she was dead." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes very bright. "The speckled band," he repeated. She said nothing else, nothing that could be understood. The doctor who examined her could find no mark upon her body, no sign of poison, no cause of death that he could name. The windows of her room had been barred from the inside, the door locked, and there was no one in the room with her. The coroner concluded that she had died of fright, though what had frightened her, no one could say. "And you heard nothing yourself that night? No sound before her scream?" "I thought," Helen hesitated, "I thought, in the moments before I heard her cry out, that I heard a low whistle, very faint, as though someone were calling softly in the night. But I could not be certain, and in the confusion that followed, I could not say where it had come from." "A whistle," said Holmes, half to himself. "And the speckled band. Most suggestive. Tell me, Miss Stoner, what has happened now that brings you to me this morning, 2 years after your sister's death?" Helen drew a long, shaking breath. "I am to be married," she said, "in the spring. And last week my stepfather insisted that repairs be made to my bedroom and that I move, temporarily, into the very room in which my sister died." A long silence followed this, and I confess I felt in that moment a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "And last night?" Holmes prompted gently. "Last night," Helen whispered, "I heard the same low whistle that I heard the night my sister died." Holmes rose at once, his face very grave. "You were right to come to me, Miss Stoner," he said. "This is a matter that cannot wait. Watson, if you are free today, I should be very glad of your company. We shall travel to Stoke Moran this morning and examine the house for ourselves. Miss Stoner, you must return home and act as though nothing has occurred. Can you do that?" "I think so," she said, though her voice trembled. "Good. We shall arrive this afternoon, and you may tell your stepfather, should he ask, that we are simply friends come to visit. Say nothing of your fears, and above all, do nothing to arouse his suspicion. Can you promise me that?" She gave her word and left shortly thereafter, and I saw Holmes stand at the window for some time after her cab had vanished into the fog, his face troubled in a way I did not often see. "This is an ugly business, Watson," he said at last. "I do not like it at all. You suspect foul play?" "I suspect," said Holmes slowly, "that Miss Helen Stoner is in very grave danger indeed, and that if we do not act quickly, she may follow her sister to an early grave. Come, we have no time to lose. Bring your revolver and whatever courage you can muster. I think we are about to encounter one of the most cunning and dangerous men it has ever been my misfortune to meet." We took the train to Leatherhead that same morning, and from there hired a dog-cart to carry us across the countryside to Stoke Moran. It was a wild and desolate landscape, the road winding between ancient hedgerows and fields gone to ruin, and at last we came to the house itself, a great crumbling manor of grey stone, 2 wings half collapsed, the other still inhabited, but showing every sign of decay and neglect. Helen met us at the door and led us quietly through the house, while her stepfather, she told us, was away in the village. She showed us first her own bedroom, then the room in which her sister had died, and finally the room occupied by Dr. Roylott himself, which lay between the two. Holmes examined each room with painstaking care, measuring, tapping upon the walls, studying the windows and the floors, and paying particular attention to a strange bell rope that hung beside the bed in Julia's old room, a rope that did not, Helen informed us, actually connect to any bell, but had been installed, her stepfather claimed, as a decorative feature. "Decorative," Holmes murmured, tugging upon it. "How singular." He knelt beside the bed and examined the floor, then turned his attention to a small ventilator set high in the wall, which opened, Helen explained, not to the outside air, but into Dr. Roylott's adjacent room. "A ventilator that does not ventilate," said Holmes, "and a bell rope that does not ring. Most instructive." It was then that we heard the sound of heavy footsteps upon the gravel outside, and Helen turned pale. "It is my stepfather," she whispered. "He has returned." A moment later, the door burst open, and there stood one of the most formidable men I have ever laid eyes upon. Dr. Grimesby Roylott was immense, well over 6 feet tall, with a face so deeply tanned and lined that he might have been carved from old wood, and eyes of such pale, cold ferocity that I instinctively took a step backward. He carried a hunting crop in one hand, and as he entered, he swung it once against his boot with a crack like a gunshot. "Which of you is Holmes?" he demanded, his voice a deep growl. "I am," said Holmes mildly, not moving from where he stood. "I know you," said Roylott, advancing into the room. "You are the meddler who has been prying into my private affairs. I have heard of you, and I have come to warn you. Keep out of my business, or you will regret it." "Your business," said Holmes, still in that same calm, almost pleasant tone, "appears to include the death of at least one young woman and the endangerment of another. I do not, as a rule, keep out of such business, Dr. Roylott." Roylott's face darkened with rage, and for a moment I thought he would strike Holmes where he stood. Instead, he bent suddenly, seized the iron poker from beside the fire, and, with a single motion of his great hands, bent it into a curve. "See that you do not cross me," he said quietly, and flung the twisted poker onto the hearth before turning and striding from the room. When he had gone, Holmes picked up the poker, examined it thoughtfully, and then, to my considerable astonishment, straightened it again with his own hands and replaced it by the fire. "I am not quite so bulky," he remarked, "but I fancy my grip is not much inferior to his own. Did you notice, Watson, that he had no idea we had been examining these rooms until this very moment? Miss Stoner has said nothing, which means he has been watching the house, or had us watched from the moment we arrived. A careful man, and a dangerous one." We took our leave shortly thereafter, Helen promising to follow Holmes's instructions to the letter, and made our way to the village inn, where we took rooms for the night. Holmes ate almost nothing at dinner, and sat afterward in deep thought, smoking pipe after pipe in silence, until at last the clock struck 11. "It is time," he said, rising. "Come, Watson. Tonight, I think, we shall solve the mystery of the speckled band." We made our way in darkness back to Stoke Moran, entering through a window Helen had left unlatched for us, and found our way by the light of a single dark lantern to the room in which Julia Stoner had died. Helen had, as instructed, retired to her old bedroom, locking the door behind her, and Holmes and I were left alone in the silent room, sitting without light upon the bed, waiting. I have waited in many strange places during my years with Sherlock Holmes, but I do not think I have ever spent a more nerve-wracking vigil than that one. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness, marked only by the distant chime of the church clock and the occasional cry of some night bird in the grounds outside. Holmes sat utterly motionless beside me, and I knew that he was listening with every fibre of his being, waiting for something he had not yet told me to expect. It was perhaps 3 in the morning when I heard it, a sound so faint that at first I thought I had imagined it. A low, soft whistle, barely audible, coming from somewhere beyond the wall. Holmes's hand closed upon my arm like a vice, and I felt him lean forward in the darkness, every muscle tense. For a moment there was silence, and then I heard something else, a sound I shall never forget as long as I live, a low hiss, gentle and continuous, coming from the ventilator above our heads. Holmes struck a match and lit the lantern, and in the sudden flare of light I saw him spring toward the bell rope and lash at it furiously with his cane, shouting, "You see it, Watson? You see it?" I saw nothing, but I heard quite distinctly a sharp metallic clang, as though something had struck the iron safe in the next room, and then a terrible scream, a scream of pain and rage and mortal terror, so dreadful that I stood frozen where I was, unable to move. "It is over," said Holmes grimly, lowering his cane. "Let us see what we have done." We made our way into Dr. Roylott's room, and there, by the light of the lantern, I saw a sight that I shall take to my grave. Dr. Grimesby Roylott sat upright in his chair, still dressed in his long grey dressing gown, his face frozen in an expression of horror and agony. Around his brow, wound twice in a tight coil, was a snake of peculiar yellowish colour, marked with brownish speckles, its head weaving slowly from side to side. "The speckled band," whispered Holmes. It was a swamp adder, he told me later, one of the deadliest serpents in India, and Roylott had trained it, over months or perhaps years, to respond to his whistle and to crawl through the ventilator, down the bell rope, and on to the bed of whichever daughter occupied that room. Julia had died of its bite 2 years before, on the very eve of her wedding, when her marriage would have cost Roylott a considerable portion of his income. And now Helen, about to be married in her turn, had been moved into the same room to suffer the same fate. But Holmes had driven the creature back with his cane, and it had returned, maddened with pain, upon its master. "I cannot say that I regret the outcome," said Holmes quietly, as we stood looking down at the dead man. "He was a man who richly deserved whatever fate befell him. But I confess, Watson, that I shall carry the thought of that poor girl's terror with me for some time to come. Had we arrived even one day later—" He did not finish the sentence, and there was no need. Helen Stoner was married in the spring, as she had planned, and lived, I believe, a long and happy life, far from the crumbling ruin of Stoke Moran. Holmes and I spoke very little of the case in the years that followed, and when we did, it was always with a certain sombre reserve, for it had been, in its way, one of the darkest matters we had ever encountered. And yet, as we rode back to London in the cold dawn light, I remember thinking that there was something almost peaceful in the knowledge that evil, however cunning, however patient, could still be outwitted by a mind sharp enough to see through its disguises, and by a man brave enough to act upon what he saw. Holmes slept most of the way back to Baker Street, his head resting against the window of the train, and I sat in silence, watching the fields and hedgerows pass, thinking of whistles in the night, and of a bell rope that rang no bell, and of a young woman who had come to us in the grey hours of the morning, asking only that someone, somewhere, might believe her when she said she was afraid. By the time we reached Baker Street, the city was waking, and the streets were beginning to fill with the ordinary traffic of the day. Holmes and I parted at his door, and I made my way home through the brightening morning, feeling, as I often did after such cases, both exhausted and strangely grateful. Grateful, I think, simply to be alive, and to live in a world where such things, though they existed, did not go entirely unanswered. Mrs. Hudson had a fire burning when Holmes returned, and a pot of strong tea waiting, and I like to think that he sat for a while in his old chair, warming his hands, before at last allowing himself to rest. The Christmas season came to London that year with all its familiar comforts, the shops bright with decorations, the streets filled with the smell of roasting chestnuts and mulled wine, and everywhere a sense of goodwill that seemed, for a few brief weeks, to soften even the hardest corners of the city. I had not seen Holmes for several days, my practice having kept me occupied with the usual winter complaints, and it was not until the second morning after Christmas that I found myself with a free hour and decided to call upon him at Baker Street, curious to know how he had spent the holiday. I found him standing before the fire in his dressing gown and slippers, turning over in his hands a battered old felt hat, examining it with the same intense concentration he might have given to a piece of evidence in a murder trial. Beside his chair lay a walking stick, equally worn, and upon the table a large goose, quite dead, still in its market wrapping. "Season's greetings, Watson," he said, without looking up from the hat. "You come at an opportune moment. I am in need of your opinion on a matter of some small interest." "I see you have acquired a goose," I observed, taking my usual chair. "Not acquired, precisely. Inherited might be the better word. The whole affair came to me through Peterson. You remember Peterson, the commissionaire? He found the hat and the goose on Christmas morning lying in the street near Tottenham Court Road, apparently dropped by their owner during some small scuffle with a group of roughs. The man himself fled before Peterson could speak with him, and so the goose and the hat were brought here in the hope that I might deduce their owner from the evidence they present." He held up the hat for my inspection. It was a plain black felt hat, several years old, much the worse for wear, with a torn lining and a coating of dust that suggested it had not been brushed in some time. "I confess I see very little," I said. "On the contrary," said Holmes, settling into his chair with evident satisfaction. "You see everything. You simply fail to reason from what you see. Let me lay out for you what this hat tells us about its owner, and you shall judge whether the inferences are warranted." He proceeded, in his calm, methodical way, to extract from that battered piece of headwear a complete portrait of the man who had worn it. A man of considerable intellect, fallen upon hard times, who had once been prosperous, but was now in decline, whose wife had ceased to love him, who drank more than was good for him, and who had no gas laid on in his home. I listened, as I always did, with a mixture of admiration and skepticism, and when he had finished, I could not help but ask how he could possibly deduce from a hat that the man's wife no longer loved him. "This hat has not been brushed for weeks," said Holmes, pointing to the accumulated dust. A man whose wife still took an interest in his appearance would not be allowed to leave the house in such a state. When a man's clothing begins to deteriorate, Watson, and his wife does nothing to prevent it, it is a clear sign that the tender influences of domesticity have been withdrawn. You see, but you do not observe. I was about to reply when Mrs. Hudson entered to announce that Peterson had returned and was asking urgently to speak with Mr. Holmes. The commissionaire was shown up at once, his face flushed with excitement, and in his hand he carried a small cardboard box, which he set upon the table with the air of a man delivering treasure. "Mr. Holmes," he said breathlessly, "you told me to take the goose home and eat it, sir, and so I did. And my wife was preparing it this morning when she found... Well, sir, you had best see for yourself." Holmes opened the box, and I leaned forward to look. Inside, lying upon a bed of cotton wool, was a jewel. It was not a large stone, perhaps no bigger than a bean, but it burned in the firelight with a blue radiance so intense, so pure, that for a moment I could do nothing but stare at it. It seemed almost to glow from within, as though it contained some fragment of frozen starlight. "Good heavens," I breathed. "Is it real?" "Unless I am very much mistaken," said Holmes softly, taking the stone from the box and holding it up to the light. "This is the Countess of Morcar's blue carbuncle." I knew the name, as did anyone who had read the newspapers in the past week. The Countess of Morcar's carbuncle was one of the most famous gems in England, a stone of incalculable value that had been stolen from the ladies' hotel room at the Cosmopolitan 5 days before Christmas. A plumber named John Horner had been arrested for the theft, the evidence against him being strong, though he protested his innocence with considerable emotion and insisted he had never touched the stone. And now, here it was, sitting upon Holmes's table, having apparently passed through the digestive system of a Christmas goose. "Peterson," said Holmes, his eyes very bright, "you have done me a great service. Tell me, where did you obtain this goose?" "From the Alpha Inn, sir, near the museum. I bought it off them just 2 days ago, along with another for myself." "And the man who lost the goose, you are certain you do not know him?" "Certain, sir. He ran off before I could get a proper look at him." Holmes sat for a moment in silence, turning the stone over in his fingers, and then rose abruptly and reached for his coat. "Watson, if you have nothing better to do this morning, I should be very glad if you would accompany me. I believe we have a call to make upon the landlord of the Alpha Inn. This affair promises to be considerably more interesting than I had anticipated." The Alpha Inn was a small, respectable public house tucked into a corner near the British Museum, its windows cheerful with holiday greenery, its interior warm and smelling pleasantly of ale and tobacco. The landlord, a ruddy-faced man named Windigate, greeted us with the easy friendliness of one accustomed to serving all comers, and when Holmes inquired about the geese, he answered readily enough. "Geese, sir? Oh, yes. Sold the last of them just 2 days ago. Fine birds they were, too. 26 in all. Bought from a supplier in Covent Garden Market, a man named Breckenridge, who keeps a stall near the left-hand corner. Sold every one of them to members of my goose club." "Goose club?" I asked. "A small arrangement, sir," said Windigate. "A few of my regulars paying £1 a week throughout the year, and come Christmas, they each receive a goose. Saves them the trouble of laying out a large sum all at once, and ensures them a proper bird for the holiday table." Holmes thanked him warmly, and we made our way directly to Covent Garden, where we found the stall of Mr. Breckenridge, a sharp-faced, argumentative man, who proved considerably less cooperative than the landlord had been. "Geese?" he snapped when Holmes inquired. "What's it to you where my geese come from? I sell them, people buy them, and that's the end of the matter. I don't keep a ledger of every bird's family history." Holmes, rather than taking offence, seemed almost amused by the man's hostility, and adopted a tone of easy banter that I had seen him use before, when he wished to provoke someone into revealing more than they intended. "I merely ask," he said lightly, "because I have a small wager with a friend regarding the origin of a particular goose sold to the Alpha Inn. I believe the birds came from the country, and my friend insists they were town-bred. A small matter, but I should hate to lose a sovereign over it." Breckenridge's face darkened. "Then you'll lose your sovereign, for the birds were town-bred, every one of them. Came from Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton Road, and if you don't believe me, you can go and ask her yourself, though why anyone would care enough to make a wager on such a thing is beyond my comprehension." Holmes expressed his gratitude with exaggerated politeness, and we had turned to leave when a small, sharp-featured man who had been standing nearby, listening intently to the exchange, suddenly stepped forward and plucked at Breckenridge's sleeve. "Beg pardon," he said urgently, "but I couldn't help overhearing. Those geese you sold to the Alpha, you're certain they came from Mrs. Oakshott?" "I've told you before, and I'll tell you again," said Breckenridge irritably. "They're sold, they're gone, and I don't know anything more about them. Now leave me in peace, or I'll set the police on you." The little man retreated, his face pale and anxious, and Holmes, with a glance at me, followed him out of the market and into the street beyond. "One moment, sir," Holmes called after him, and the man turned, startled. "I see you have an interest in those geese," Holmes continued. "Perhaps we might speak for a moment? I believe our interests may align." The man looked from Holmes to me and back again, his expression wary, and then, as though coming to some internal decision, he nodded slowly. "My name is Ryder," he said. "James Ryder. I'm the head attendant at the Hotel Cosmopolitan, and yes, I have an interest in those geese. A very great interest indeed, though I don't see how it could possibly matter to you." "On the contrary," said Holmes quietly, "I believe it matters a great deal. Suppose we return to Baker Street, Mr. Ryder, and discuss the matter in comfort. I think you will find it worth your while." Ryder followed us back to Baker Street in a state of evident agitation, his hands trembling, his face drawn and pale, and when we were seated before the fire, Holmes gestured toward the small cardboard box still sitting upon the table. "Before we begin," he said, "perhaps you would care to examine this." He opened the box, and Ryder's eyes fell upon the blue carbuncle. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The man went white as chalk, half rose from his chair, and then fell back again, his mouth working soundlessly, his hands ripping the armrests as though he feared he might faint. "I see you recognize it," said Holmes gently. For a long moment, Ryder said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. The story that emerged, haltingly and with much prompting, was a sordid one, and I shall give only its outline here, for the details are painful and reflect little credit upon anyone involved. Ryder, it seemed, had conspired with a woman named Catherine Cusack, the Countess of Morcar's own maid, to steal the carbuncle from the Countess's jewel case. Ryder had arranged for the plumber, John Horner, to be called to the Countess's room on some pretext, intending to cast suspicion upon him once the theft was discovered. The plan had worked perfectly. Horner had been arrested, and Ryder had successfully taken the stone. But possessing the carbuncle and disposing of it safely were two very different problems, and Ryder, terrified of being searched, had conceived a desperate plan. His sister kept geese and was preparing to send several to market to be sold for Christmas. Ryder had forced the stone down the throat of one particular goose, a large bird with a distinctive barred tail, intending to collect it later from the market stall where his sister's birds were to be sold. But when he had gone to retrieve the bird, he discovered to his horror
that his sister's geese had been mixed with another batch from a different supplier, and he could no longer distinguish which bird contained the stone. In desperation, he had been haunting the market for days, hoping to trace the birds to their purchasers, but the geese had already been sold and scattered across London. And now, he finished miserably, Horner will be tried and convicted for a crime he did not commit, and I have lost everything and gained nothing. Holmes sat in silence for a long time after Ryder had finished speaking, his fingers steepled, his eyes half closed, and I could see that he was considering the matter from every possible angle. At last he rose, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the street below, where the winter afternoon was already fading into dusk. "Mr. Ryder," he said at last, without turning, "I am not a police officer, and it is not my place to administer justice. I am a consulting detective, and my business is the solving of problems, not the punishment of wrongdoers. I believe you are a weak man, and a foolish one, but not, I think, a naturally vicious one. You have made a terrible mistake, and it has cost an innocent man his freedom." He turned from the window and looked directly at Ryder. "I am going to do something that may surprise you. I am going to let you
Go. Ryder stared at him, uncomprehending. "Go," he whispered. "Go," said Holmes firmly. "Leave England tonight, if you are wise. Go far away, and do not return. I will see to it that the stone is returned to the Countess, and that Horner is cleared of all charges. But if you remain in this country, or if you ever again attempt anything of this nature, I will personally ensure that you spend the rest of your days in prison. Do you understand me?" Ryder needed no further encouragement. He stammered his thanks, seized his hat, and fled from the room as though the devil himself were at his heels, and a moment later we heard the street door slam behind him. I looked at Holmes in considerable surprise. "You are letting him go? After what he has done?" "After what he has done," said Holmes, returning to his chair. "He will carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. I do not think James Ryder will ever again attempt to steal so much as a loaf of bread, Watson. Fear has a way of reforming men where justice sometimes fails. And besides," he added, reaching for his pipe, "it is Christmas, the season of forgiveness, is it not? I am not in the habit of handing men over to the police simply because I have the power to do so. Horner will be freed, the Countess will have her stone, and Ryder will live out his days in whatever distant corner of the world he chooses, knowing how close he came to complete ruin. I think that is punishment enough." He lit his pipe and settled back with a small smile. "And I confess, Watson, that I have a particular affection for this case. It is not often that a crime is solved by the simple expedient of following a Christmas goose through the streets of London. There is something almost whimsical about the whole affair, something that appeals to whatever small corner of sentiment I still possess." The carbuncle was duly returned to the Countess, and John Horner was released without charge, the case against him quietly dismissed for lack of evidence. The newspapers, finding no scandal to report, let the matter drop, and within a week the whole affair had been forgotten by everyone save Holmes, myself, and one James Ryder, who was last heard of boarding a steamer bound for Australia on the morning after our interview. Holmes never spoke of the case with any particular pride, but I noticed in the weeks that followed that he kept the little cardboard box in which the stone had been delivered tucked away in a drawer of his desk, and once or twice I saw him take it out and look at it with a faint, thoughtful smile, as though remembering something that pleased him. It was, I think, one of the gentlest cases we ever worked on together, and in its own quiet way, one of the most satisfying. A reminder that not every mystery need end in tragedy, and that even in the darkest corners of London, there was still room, at Christmas, for mercy. The days grew shorter as January came, and the festive decorations came down from the shop windows, and London returned to its usual grey routine. I called less frequently at Baker Street during those weeks, my practice demanding much of my time, but I thought of Holmes often, and wondered how he occupied himself during the long winter evenings when no client came to his door. It was not until late February that another case of any significance came our way, and when it did, it arrived in a manner so strange, so utterly unexpected, that even Holmes, who prided himself on being prepared for any contingency, was caught entirely off guard. But that, I think, is a story for another part of this long night. And before I continue, let me pause a moment, and let the fire burn low, and let the silence of Baker Street settle around us once more. For there is no need to rush. The night is long, and there are mysteries still to tell. And somewhere in the fog and lamplight of Victorian London, Sherlock Holmes is waiting, patient and observant as ever, for the next strange visitor to climb his stairs. Spring came late that year, reluctant and uncertain, and I remember the morning clearly because it was one of those rare occasions when Holmes appeared at my door unannounced, rather than sending a telegram or waiting for me to call upon him. It was barely past 7 o'clock, and I was still at breakfast when my wife showed him into the dining room. He was already dressed for travel, his travelling coat buttoned to the chin, and there was about him that particular quality of suppressed energy that told me a case of unusual interest had presented itself. "My dear Watson," he said, declining the chair my wife offered him, "I apologize for the early hour, but I have just received a telegram from Dartmoor, and I must catch the 11 o'clock train from Paddington. I wondered whether you might be free to accompany me. The matter concerns a disappearance and a murder, and unless I am very much mistaken, it will prove to be one of the most singular cases we have yet encountered." I looked at my wife, who smiled and nodded before I could even ask the question. "Of course you must go," she said. "I know that expression on Mr. Holmes's face. He will give you no peace until you agree." Within the hour, I had packed a small bag and met Holmes at the station, where he secured us a first-class compartment and, once the train had pulled out of London, settled back against the cushions with evident satisfaction. "You are familiar, I presume, with the name Silver Blaze?" he asked, producing his pipe and tobacco pouch. "The racehorse? Yes, of course. Everyone in England knows Silver Blaze. He was the favourite for the Wessex Cup, was he not?" He was indeed, and 3 nights ago he vanished from his stable at King's Pyland in Dartmoor. His trainer, John Straker, was found dead upon the moor the following morning, his head smashed in by a heavy blow. The horse has not been seen since. I stared at him. "Good heavens! And they have no idea what happened?" "They have a great many ideas," said Holmes dryly, "most of them quite useless. Inspector Gregory of Scotland Yard is already on the scene and has, I gather, arrested a suspect, a man named Fitzroy Simpson, a bookmaker who was seen loitering near the stables on the night of the disappearance. But Gregory has telegraphed me nonetheless, which suggests he is not entirely satisfied with his own conclusions. I thought we might go down and have a look for ourselves." The journey to Dartmoor took most of the day, the train carrying us westward through countryside that grew progressively wilder and more desolate, until at last we descended into a landscape of rolling moorland, broken by great tors of grey stone and crossed by wandering sheep tracks. It was a lonely, wind-swept place, and I could well imagine how a man might vanish into it without a trace. We were met at the small country station by Inspector Gregory, a tall, fair-haired man with a brisk, confident manner that barely concealed, I thought, a certain unease about the case he was investigating. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, shaking our hands warmly, "I am very glad you have come. This is an uncommonly strange business, and I confess there are aspects of it that puzzle me considerably." "Then let us examine the scene," said Holmes, "and see whether the facts are as strange as they appear." Gregory drove us in a trap to King's Pyland, the training establishment where Silver Blaze had been kept. It was a substantial property, set in a shallow valley among the moors, consisting of a large house, several outbuildings, and a row of well-appointed stables that spoke of considerable wealth and care. The stable from which Silver Blaze had been taken was at the far end of the row, and Gregory led us there directly, pointing out as we walked the various features of the case that he considered significant. The stable was locked from the inside, he explained, and the only key was in the possession of John Straker, the trainer, who slept in the loft above. On the night in question, Straker came down at about 9 o'clock to check on the horses, a practice of his whenever there was a particularly valuable animal in his care. The stable boy, a lad named Hunter, was on watch in the tack room nearby, and he reported that Straker entered the stable and remained there for some minutes before leaving again. Hunter saw nothing unusual. "And afterward?" Holmes prompted. "Afterward, Hunter reports that he was offered a supper of curried mutton by a man who came to the stable door, a man he later identified as Fitzroy Simpson, the bookmaker I mentioned. Hunter ate the supper and shortly thereafter fell into a deep sleep. He did not wake until morning, by which time the stable door was open, Silver Blaze was gone, and Straker had vanished. Straker's body was found several hours later, about a quarter-mile out on the moor, his skull fractured and a small knife clutched in his hand." Holmes had been listening to all this with his eyes half closed, but now he opened them and looked about the stable with keen interest. "And the horse?" he asked. "No trace of him at all?" "None whatsoever. He has simply disappeared, along with whoever took him. We have searched the moor for miles in every direction and questioned every household and traveller within 10 miles of this place, but no one has seen anything." "Curious," murmured Holmes. "Most curious. Tell me, Inspector, what evidence led you to arrest this man Simpson?" Gregory drew himself up slightly, clearly pleased to be asked. "The evidence is substantial, Mr. Holmes. Simpson was seen loitering near the stables earlier that evening. He made inquiries about the horses, particularly about Silver Blaze, in a manner that aroused suspicion. He cannot account for his movements during the critical hours of the night, and most damningly, we found in his possession a heavy walking stick, weighted with lead, which could easily have been the weapon used to kill Straker." "And yet," said Holmes gently, "he is not in possession of the horse, which was, I presume, the object of the entire exercise. A curious oversight for a criminal, would you not say?" Gregory frowned. "He may have had accomplices. He may have hidden the animal somewhere we have not yet searched. These things take time to unravel, Mr. Holmes." "Indeed they do," said Holmes. "Might I examine the stable?" Gregory stood aside, and Holmes entered the loose box from which Silver Blaze had been taken, moving slowly about the straw-covered floor, examining the walls, the door, the small window set high in one corner. He knelt in several places, studying the ground with his lens, and once he picked up a small object and slipped it into his pocket without comment. Afterward, we examined the spot on the moor where Straker's body had been found. It was a desolate place, marked now only by a flattened patch of heather where the corpse had lain. Holmes quartered the ground methodically, moving in widening circles, his eyes on the earth, occasionally stooping to examine some mark or feature invisible to me. It was during this examination that he paused beside a small hollow and called me over. "What do you make of this, Watson?" I looked where he pointed and saw, quite clearly, the prints of a horse's hooves in a patch of soft ground. "Silver Blaze," I said. "He came this way." He did indeed, and notice, if you will, the shape of the prints. This is a racing horse, Watson, shod with light plates designed for speed, not for rough country. And yet see how cleanly these prints are formed, how evenly spaced. This is not a horse that was being led or driven in panic. This is a horse that was walking quite calmly, of its own accord. But why would a stolen horse walk calmly away from its stable in the middle of the night? "Why, indeed," said Holmes softly. "That, Watson, is precisely the question we must answer." We spent the remainder of the afternoon interviewing the members of the household, the stable hands, the cook, the maid, and Mrs. Straker herself, a quiet, tearful woman who seemed genuinely devastated by her husband's death.
Holmes asked each of them a series of questions that seemed to me entirely random and disconnected from the case at hand, inquiring about matters as trivial as the household menus, the servants' days off, and whether anyone had recently purchased new clothing. It was only when we had finished and were being driven back to our inn for the evening that I ventured to ask what he had learned. "A great deal," said Holmes, "though much of it serves only to deepen the mystery. Tell me, Watson, did you observe Mrs. Straker's dress?" "I cannot say that I did, particularly." "It was expensive, Watson, far more expensive than a trainer's wife would normally be expected to afford, even a successful trainer. And there were dressmakers' bills upon the desk in Straker's study, bills from a very fashionable establishment in London, amounting to a sum considerably beyond what a man in his position ought to spend on such things." "You think he was living beyond his means?" "I think," said Holmes slowly, "that John Straker had debts, and that a man with debts is a man who might be tempted to do something foolish. But we shall know more tomorrow. I have asked Gregory to arrange for us to examine Straker's personal effects, and I believe they may
prove most illuminating. That evening, we dined at the small country inn where we had taken rooms, and Holmes spent the hours afterward in silence, smoking pipe after pipe and staring into the fire, while I read the local newspaper and listened to the wind moving across the moor outside. It was not until we had retired to our respective rooms that I heard him moving about, and when I rose and looked into the corridor, I saw him dressed once more in his travelling clothes, a dark lantern in his hand. "I am going out for an hour or two, Watson," he said quietly. "Do not wait up for me. There is something I wish to examine while the household is asleep." He would say no more, and I returned to bed, though I confess I did not sleep well, listening to the wind and wondering what Holmes was doing out on the dark moor in the middle of the night. He returned sometime before dawn, and when I came down to breakfast, I found him already seated at the table, looking tired but satisfied. "I trust your nocturnal wanderings were productive?" I asked. "Very much so," said Holmes. "I have found Silver Blaze." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "You have found him? Where?" "Not 2 miles from here, stabled quite comfortably at the Mapleton training establishment, the great rival to King's Pyland, as it happens. He is being kept under the name Warwick Prince, and his owner, a gentleman named Silas Brown, has been at some pains to disguise his appearance by means of a few simple alterations. But it is Silver Blaze. I am quite certain of it." "Good heavens! Then Brown is the thief?" "Brown is a receiver of stolen property, and a rather frightened one at that. I had a very interesting conversation with him in the small hours of the morning, and I believe he will be more than willing to return the horse to his rightful owner, provided we agree not to prosecute him. He claims, quite truthfully I think, that he had nothing to do with the theft itself, but merely accepted the horse when it was brought to him by a stranger on the night in question." "But who brought it to him?" "Ah," said Holmes, with a small smile. "That is the question, is it not? And I believe, Watson, that we shall have the answer before the day is out. Come, we have one more visit to make." We returned to King's Pyland that morning, and Holmes asked Gregory to assemble everyone connected with the case, the stable hands, the household staff, and Mrs. Straker, in the drawing room of the main house. When they were gathered, Holmes stood before the fireplace and addressed them in the quiet, methodical manner he always adopted when explaining a solution. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have asked you here because I believe I can now explain what happened on the night Silver Blaze disappeared, and I think you will find the truth considerably stranger than any of you have imagined." He paused, and I saw every eye in the room fixed upon him. "Let us begin," he continued, "with the curious incident of the dog in the night time." Inspector Gregory frowned. "There was no curious incident. The dog did nothing in the night time." "That," said Holmes, "was the curious incident." He let the silence stretch a moment before continuing. "Silver Blaze was stabled in a locked building, guarded by a stable boy, in a yard patrolled by a watchdog that barked at any stranger who approached. And yet,
On the night of the disappearance, the dog did not bark. Why? Because the person who took Silver Blaze from his stable was not a stranger. It was someone the dog knew well, someone who had every right to be in that stable at any hour of the day or night. "John Straker," I said suddenly, understanding flooding over me. Precisely. John Straker took his own horse from the stable sometime after midnight and led him out onto the moor. The question is, why? Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a small object, which he held up for all to see. It was a surgical knife, small and razor-sharp, of the kind used for delicate operations. "I found this," he said, "in Straker's pocket when his body was discovered. It is not the sort of knife a man carries for general purposes. It is a very specific instrument, designed for a very specific task. And when I examined the bills in Straker's study, I found that he owed a considerable sum to a London dressmaker. Debts incurred, I believe, not for his wife, but for another woman entirely, with whom he had become entangled." Mrs. Straker gasped, her face going pale, but Holmes continued gently. "Straker was desperate for money, and he conceived a plan that would have netted him a considerable sum had it succeeded. He intended to lame Silver Blaze, just enough to prevent the horse from winning the Wessex Cup, but not so much as to be immediately obvious. He would do this by means of a small surgical incision upon the horse's leg, a delicate operation that would require privacy and darkness. He led Silver Blaze out onto the moor in the middle of the night, carrying his knife, intending to perform the operation there where he would not be disturbed." "But what went wrong?" asked Gregory. "The horse," said Holmes simply. "Silver Blaze is a spirited animal, and when Straker attempted to restrain him and raise the knife, the horse panicked. He lashed out with his hind legs. You will recall that the prints I found showed a horse walking calmly, but at the sight of Straker's body, the ground was much disturbed, indicating a struggle. And one of those hooves struck Straker in the forehead, killing him instantly. The knife fell from his hand. The horse, frightened and free, wandered across the moor until he was found by someone, most likely a stable hand from Mapleton, who recognized his value and brought him to Silas Brown." The room was utterly silent. "The man you have arrested, Fitzroy Simpson, had nothing to do with any of it. He is simply a bookmaker who was foolish enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Silver Blaze is even now stabled at Mapleton and can be returned to his rightful owner whenever you wish, Inspector." Gregory stared at Holmes, his mouth slightly open, and then, slowly, began to nod. "By God," he said softly, "I believe you are right." Mrs. Straker had begun to weep quietly, and I felt a great wave of pity for her, learning in such a manner not only that her husband was dead, but that he had betrayed her and conspired against the very establishment he was trusted to protect. Holmes spoke to her briefly and kindly before we left, and I saw him press something into her hand. Money, I suspected, though he said nothing of it to me. Silver Blaze was duly returned to King's Pyland and ran in the Wessex Cup 3 weeks later, winning by a length and a half in one of the finest displays of racing I have ever witnessed. Holmes and I attended the race at the invitation of the horse's owner, and I remember standing in the sun, watching that magnificent animal thunder past the post, and thinking how strange it was that so much drama, so much tragedy, could turn upon something as simple as a man's debts and a horse's fear. On the train back to London, Holmes was in an expansive mood and spoke at length about the case, dissecting its various features with evident satisfaction. "It is the small anomalies, Watson," he said, "that always prove most significant. A dog that does not bark, a knife that does not belong, bills that do not match a household's income. These are the threads that, when pulled, unravel the entire tapestry." "And yet," I said, "Straker is dead and cannot be punished for what he did." "Straker has been punished," said Holmes quietly.
He is beyond our justice now, Watson, and I confess I feel more pity for him than anger. He was a weak man who made a terrible choice, and he paid for it with his life. That seems punishment enough to me." He turned to look out the window at the darkening countryside rushing past. "Besides," he added, "Silver Blaze will run again. The horse, at least, has been saved, and that is something." I remember thinking, as we pulled into Paddington that evening, that there was something almost merciful in Holmes's view of the case, a recognition that not every villain was truly evil, and that sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator was thinner than we liked to believe. It was a thought I would return to many times in the years ahead, as Holmes and I encountered cases of greater complexity and moral ambiguity. But that evening I was simply glad to be home, and glad that the great horse, Silver Blaze, was safe, and that justice, in its own strange way, had been done. The spring deepened into summer, and the London streets grew warm and dusty, and life at Baker Street returned to its familiar rhythms. Holmes took on a few smaller cases, a matter of a missing will, a case of suspected poisoning that proved to be nothing more than bad fish, a curious problem involving a clockmaker's apprentice, but nothing that required my particular assistance, and so I saw less of him during those months than I might have liked. It was not until autumn that another case of real significance came to us, and when it did, it came in a manner so unexpected, so utterly outside the usual pattern of Holmes's work, that even now, looking back upon it, I find myself surprised by the turn events took. But the night is long still, and there is time enough for one more tale before the dawn comes to Baker Street. Let the fire burn a little lower. Let the city beyond the windows grow quieter still. And let me tell you, in the way I remember it best, of the last great case I shall recount tonight. A case that took us not into the dark corners of London, but into the bright, careful world of the English countryside, and into a mystery that had waited, patient and silent, for more than 200 years.